What if the only witness to a brutal murder was a bird? Welcome back. I hope you're doing well today, mentally, physically, spiritually, or maybe just hanging in there. Either way, I'm glad you're here. Because what I'm about to share with you isn't just storytelling. It's truth wrapped in terror, mystery rooted in reality. These aren't ghost stories whispered around a campfire. These are real events backed by evidence testimony and scars, some physical, some emotional. And yet the deeper you listen, the more they'll feel like fiction. That's the strange thing about the world. Sometimes the unbelievable doesn't come from the supernatural, but from what's already out there hiding in plain sight. Today's episode features 3 encounters, 3 people, 3 moments when the world shifted and nothing was ever the same again. First, we'll visit a quiet home in Texas where a man is ambushed in his kitchen, but justice comes from the unlikeliest of allies. Then we'll dive into the heart of the Peruvian Amazon, where an ancient legend may have just walked out of the trees in broad daylight. And finally, we'll travel to a remote forest in Argentina, where one man's solitude is shattered by something with claws and a human face. Each of these stories is real, verified, and yet as you listen, you'll start to wonder what else out there have we been calling a myth. Settle in. Press pause on the outside world, because it's time to begin. Let's start with the bird who refused to be a bystander. Story 1. The Cockatoo Murder Case. When a bird became the only witness. Under the warm glow of Christmas Eve in Dallas, 2001, Kevin Butler stood in his modest kitchen, carefully preparing food he planned to bring to a friend's holiday gathering the next day. The kitchen was filled with the aroma of slow-cooked meatballs and simmering sauce, blending with the gentle hum of evening silence that blanketed his quiet suburban neighborhood. Kevin was a businessman, a man who valued order and loyalty, and tonight he took comfort in the solitude of routine. Except he wasn't entirely alone. Perched not far from the kitchen, watching with idle curiosity, was Larry, a cockatoo with snowy feathers and a personality that filled the house more than any music ever could. Larry wasn't just a pet, he was Kevin's companion, his shadow, his tiny confidant. Kevin had rescued him 2 years earlier, and since then, they had become inseparable. Kevin often joked that Larry understood him better than most people did, and sometimes it wasn't a joke. But that evening, as Kevin wiped his hands and began to reach for another bowl, he heard something odd. Voices. Not from inside, but just beyond the front door. 2 male voices, slurred and loud. Instinct prickled at Kevin's spine. He knew those voices. Johnny Cerna and his half-brother Daniel Torres. Men who once worked with him, men he had cut ties with after discovering their involvement in financial misconduct, forgery, and deceit. Their fallout had been messy and public, with threats tossed like confetti and bad blood lingering thick in the air. Kevin moved quickly to the door, heart racing. He wasn't afraid, not exactly, but a storm had just entered his yard, and storms always bring damage. He opened the door, and there they stood, faces, flushed eyes gleaming with a mixture of alcohol and anger. The confrontation was immediate. They lunged without hesitation. Fists, first, fury, second. Kevin stumbled backwards, struggling to brace himself, but the attack was overwhelming. They pushed him down, kicking, striking, screaming. He barely had time to cry out before they had dragged him inside and shut the door behind them. His head hit the floor. The world spun. One of them disappeared down the hall, and when he returned, he held a cord. Within seconds, Kevin was tied up, helpless on the cold tile floor. Then came the knives. Kevin fought, twisted, screamed, but the blades found him again and again. Somewhere in the haze of pain and betrayal, Kevin saw a flash of white, a flutter of feathers. Larry. Larry had seen it all. He had heard the violence, felt the chaos, and knew somehow that Kevin was in danger. The Cockatoo didn't fly away. He flew in. With wings spread wide and talons ready, Larry darted toward the attackers. He clawed, he pecked, he went straight for Daniel, targeting his head, his eyes, his face. Daniel swatted and cursed, but Larry persisted. In the frenzy, Larry broke skin. He drew blood. A moment later, the stabbing stopped. Johnny and Daniel, breathless and bloodied, fled the scene. Silence fell. Kevin was gone. Larry lay still, his small body broken by the violence. When authorities arrived, what they saw was horrific. 2 victims, 1 human, 1 bird, but something stood out. Forensics found an unusual trace on Larry's beak. Human blood, not Kevin's. Investigators looked closer. They found that Larry had indeed bitten one of the assailants during the struggle. DNA analysis confirmed the blood belonged to Daniel Torres. That microscopic clue carried by a cockatoo provided the forensic link needed to identify and charge both men. Without it, justice might have slipped away. Instead, Larry, who had lived his last breath defending the man he loved, became the key witness in a murder investigation. Daniel and Johnny were arrested, tried, and sentenced to life in prison. The courtroom buzzed with disbelief when prosecutors presented the blood evidence collected from a bird. The jury didn't laugh. They listened, and they believed. Because sometimes loyalty doesn't need a voice to be heard. Sometimes a feathered shadow does what no one else will. Larry never lived to see justice served, but the mark he left both literally and symbolically was undeniable. His name is remembered not just by those who knew Kevin, but by investigators who've never forgotten the case where a cockatoo cracked a murder. In the quiet corners of forensic textbooks and whispered stories among detectives, Larry's story lives on. A creature of instinct, love, and fight. The little bird who did not fly away. They say loyalty has no language, but in Kevin's case, it had feathers and a beak. That was the kind of justice no one saw coming. But while his killer was brought to light, not every thread is so easily explained. Because in the next story, what hunted a teenage girl wasn't just terrifying, it was something no one could agree was even human. And it didn't come through the door, it rose from the trees. Story 2. Pelacaras of the Amazon. When legends came floating out of the trees. What would you do if the thing standing between you and your front door wasn't human, and it wasn't trying to hide it? Deep in the heart of the Peruvian Amazon, where the jungle doesn't sleep and the shadows stretch longer than the night, a 15-year-old girl named Talia de la Diaz found herself face to face with something no one could explain and no one could forget. It was July 29th, 2023, just after 6:30 in the evening, and while most families in her small isolated village were preparing dinner or locking in for the night, Talia was standing barefoot outside the back door of her home, staring into the trees. The rainforest was her backyard, thick and loud and alive, a place she'd grown up with but never truly trusted. Her house sat on the edge of the green, just a few yards away from a squat grapefruit tree that had been there since before she was born. And that night, all she wanted was to pick a grapefruit to make juice for her family. It should have taken 60 seconds. But that tree might as well have been miles away, because lately no one walked into the forest without a second thought. Not after the stories, not after the sightings, not after the rumors. For weeks, villagers had reported strange figures watching them from the tree line, tall, silent, unmoving. Some said they had glowing green eyes. Others swore they floated rather than walked. The locals had a name for them: Pelacaras, face peelers. Not a legend, not a metaphor, a real fear. According to those who believe Pelacaras were invaders who targeted villagers, slitting their throats, peeling off their faces, and harvesting fat from the bodies to sell on black markets. There were whispers they weren't even human. There were louder whispers that they were wearing stolen human faces. Patrols were organized. Men took turns staying up all night, walking the perimeter with flashlights and old rifles. Fear had become routine. But routine doesn't mean safety. Talia tried to stay logical. She picked grapefruit 100 times. She could see the fruit from where she stood, just 10 yards, maybe 12. And besides, the night patrol was active. She wasn't alone. She took a breath, scanned the yard one more time, and stepped off the porch. She ran barefoot and quick across the grass to the tree. She reached up, grabbed a grapefruit, turned, and froze. 2 figures stood between her and the back door. They were tall, inhumanly tall. One of them nearly touched the lower branches of a nearby tree. Their limbs were long and too thin, and their eyes, impossibly bright and green, pierced the thick dusk like headlights in fog. They didn't blink. They didn't move. Talia's body locked. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her legs had forgotten how. Her eyes locked with theirs, and in that moment something ancient and feral told her exactly what she was seeing. These were Pelacaras, not stories, not shadows. They were here. One of them tilted its head slightly as if studying her. Its face was stretched, elongated, unnaturally, like skin pulled tight over the wrong bones. Then the taller one began to move, but it didn't walk. It glided silent, floating inches above the ground, closing the distance like it was pulled by strings. Talia dropped the grapefruit. She turned, but it was too late. Hands grabbed her strong and cold. She hit the ground hard. One pinned her down while the other covered her nose and mouth. She couldn't breathe. Her lungs burned. Panic threatened to tear her apart from the inside, and then she saw it, a blade or something like it, thin and gleaming, pressed against her neck. Her vision blurred, and her last thoughts before blacking out weren't of fear, but of the stories. The horrible, unbelievable stories that weren't so unbelievable anymore. Then instinct surged. Adrenaline shattered the paralysis. With every ounce of strength she had, Talia twisted, flailed, kicked. She broke free for a split second long enough to scream. A single sharp cry that split the night. And someone answered, shouts from the village, running feet, flashlight beams slicing through the darkness. The night patrol was coming. Her attackers hesitated. Talia crawled backwards, scrambling to her feet. A man with a rifle burst into view. He fired toward the creatures. More patrolmen followed. Talia looked back once, just once, and what she saw burned itself into her memory forever. The 2 figures were rising, not fleeing, rising. As in floating off the ground, eyes still fixed on her, drifting silently into the sky. The patrol fired again. Bullets cracked through the trees, but the figures didn't fall. They simply vanished into the darkness above. Talia collapsed in her mother's arms minutes later, sobbing, shaking alive. Physically, she was unharmed. No marks, no wounds. But mentally, something inside her had been rewired. The village was thrown into chaos. Parents refused to let their children go outside. Patrols were doubled. The story made it to the authorities, and the Peruvian government stepped in. Investigators arrived to interview Talia and the patrol, and reviewed the site. Days later, an official statement was released. It claimed the culprits were members of an illegal mining operation using experimental jetpack technology to frighten villagers and keep them away from hidden sites. They suggested the glowing eyes were part of masks, the levitation a trick of the jet propulsion. But the villagers didn't buy it. Talia didn't buy it. Jetpacks don't hover silently. Jetpacks don't move without sound or heat. Jetpacks don't wear faces that don't fit. And jetpacks don't press blades against your throat while covering your mouth like they've done it before. To this day, the truth depends on who you ask. The government says it was a scare tactic. The villagers say the Pelacaras are real. And Talia, she still doesn't go outside after dark, not even for grapefruit. What do you do when the government says it was a jetpack but your nightmares tell you otherwise? For Talia, survival came with questions no one could answer. But our final story today takes us even deeper into the wilderness where the silence doesn't mean peace. In the remote forests of Argentina, one man would learn that legends don't always stay in stories. Sometimes they claw their way out. Story 3. Ukumar of Argentina, the beast, with a human face that tore through the silence. What if the thing hunting you looked like something you've seen before, but moved like something you've never survived? Deep in the forested mountains of northern Argentina, beyond the paved roads and the reach of cell towers, there lived a man named Polar Gomez, who had chosen the trees over the towns, the silence over the noise. It was May 21st, 1974, and for Polar, it was just another workday. The 40-year-old lived alone in a wooden cabin surrounded by dense forest. He had no phone, no vehicle, and no neighbors within miles. He survived off the land chopping and selling lumber, trusting his instincts and machete more than any authority or machine. That afternoon, Polar set out with his axe and blade, moving through the thick underbrush to reach a tree he'd been eyeing for weeks. The forest was alive with sound birds, insects, the occasional crack of a branch. He found the tree a tall specimen with rich bark and paused. Not out of fatigue, but confusion. High on the trunk, well above eye level, were deep claw marks, thick, wide, spaced like fingers. Polar squinted. A bear, maybe. But they didn't roam this region, and not ones that big. He brushed the thought aside. He had work to do. He raised his axe muscles, moving from memory, and struck. Wood splintered. The tree began to groan. Minutes later, with a final swing, it toppled, shaking the ground. And that's when he heard it. A low, guttural growl. Behind him. Close. He spun around but saw nothing. No movement, no sound. Just the quiet trees staring back. Maybe it was the crash of the tree. Maybe it was his mind playing tricks. He exhaled, shook it off, and went back to work. The rest of the afternoon passed in routine. He chopped the tree into sections, carried the logs back to his cabin one by one, stacking them neatly in the clearing nearby. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the forest in gold and shadow, Polar felt the familiar tug of hunger. He had stew left from the night before. No need to cook. He set up a small fire near his outdoor stove, placed the pot on top, and sat at the old wooden table beside it. The air was warm. A light breeze rustled the leaves. But something felt off. The forest, usually filled with the ambient noise of nighttime, had gone silent. Not quiet, silent. No crickets, no rustling. No birds, just the crackling of his stove. He knew that kind of silence. Predators. He scanned the tree line, eyes darting. No movement, no eyeshine, no sound. He considered going back inside, but didn't want to leave the stove unattended. He stood hesitant and decided to make one quick trip to shut off the vents and grab his food. He walked briskly, turned toward the pot, and the world exploded. A massive force slammed into his back. He hit the ground hard, the air knocked from his lungs. Something was on him. Heavy, furry, smelling of damp earth and rot. He reached for the machete he dropped earlier near the stove. Fingers found the handle. He rolled. He swung. The creature recoiled, giving him just enough time to scramble to his feet and run toward the lumber pile by his cabin. Behind him, he could hear its breathing fast and low, followed by the crushing of leaves. He didn't look back. He climbed the wood stack, slipping, scrambling, using raw adrenaline to pull himself onto the cabin's roof. He turned to face his attacker, but the clearing was empty. The forest was still silent. He touched his head. Warm blood. His hand came away wet. He reached higher. His right ear was gone, ripped off. The pain hadn't even registered yet. He crouched on the roof, machete in hand, scanning, waiting. The thing didn't return. The forest remained still. He didn't sleep, just waited, eyes burning, muscles locked. When morning came and the birds returned with their songs, Polar knew it was safe, relatively. He climbed down, bandaged his head the best he could, and began the long trek to the nearest building, a woodworking shop nearly a mile away. When the workers there saw him bloodied and shaken, they drove him straight to the hospital. He survived. Barely. Doctors treated his head wound, stitched what they could, and gave him painkillers. Then the police came. They asked what had happened. Polar told them everything. The claw marks, the silence, the attack, the face. Yes, the face. Because when he swung his machete that night, for one brief second, he saw it. Not a bear, not a panther, not any animal he knew. A creature covered in black hair, 6 feet tall, long arms, sharp claws, but a human face. Distorted, wrong, but human. The officer taking notes stopped writing. Said bears don't have faces like that. Said what Polar saw must have been a hallucination, maybe trauma, maybe blood loss. But Polar knew what he saw. He was a man who lived alone in a forest. A man who understood nature. A man who didn't spook easy. This was something else. The report filed it as a bear attack. Case closed. But Polar wasn't alone. In the years that followed, more reports trickled in from nearby regions. Descriptions matched. A tall bear-like creature. Human face. Silent movements. Locals gave it a name. Ukumar. A beast from indigenous folklore. Part man, part beast. And now, maybe something more. To this day, the Ukumar remains a myth to some, a memory to others. But if you ask Polar Gomez, he'll tell you plainly. The forest has rules, and sometimes it makes things to break them. Some stories stay with you, not because they're the loudest, but because they whisper something you can't hear. A bird that fought back. A girl who screamed through the silence. A man who saw a face no one believed. These weren't just brush-ups with danger. They were collisions with the unknown. And in each case, the question isn't just what happened. It's why we're still talking about it. Maybe it's because deep down, we all feel that edge, that place where the everyday ends and something older begins. A presence in the room when you're sure you're alone. A shape in the trees that doesn't move quite right. A story you heard once and never stopped thinking about. If these tales made your skin crawl or made you pause for just a moment longer in your kitchen backyard or front porch, then maybe you understand. You're not alone, and you're not strange for wondering what else is out there. You're just listening closely. Most people don't. Thank you for spending your time here today, for letting these moments into your ears, your mind, your imagination. There are hundreds more stories waiting if you're brave enough to keep listening. But for now, take a breath, shake off the dark, and we'll be waiting next time in the quiet just before the scream. Until then, stay safe and stay curious.